Um, Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I will be presenting, my name is Prue Chung, and I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis on fish dispersal decision-making model to examine rehabilitation and restoration of habitats in the Irrawaddy Basin. And my supervisor is Bronwyn Powell. Oh, that didn't work. So just to give you an outline of my presentation, I'll be presenting an introduction that will cover the Irrawaddy Basin and a bit of background. I'll address some of the fisheries sector and look at some of the problems within the sector, and then present my research questions along with addressing methodologies and data in terms of addressing these research questions. Hopefully some expected outcomes I'll present, and beneficiaries, challenges and limitations of the project, along with the time frame and potential presentation sites venues. So if you don't know, Myanmar is situated in Southeast Asia, and the Irrawaddy River is the longest river in Myanmar. It starts in the Himalayas and extends to the southern tip of the country, where it fans out into a delta before discharging into the Andaman Sea. 93% of the Irrawaddy Basin is contained in Myanmar, and it's an important resource for the country economically, socially, and environmentally. The Delta region itself is one of the largest subbasins, and it covers over 50,000 kilometres square and is densely populated with over 11 million inhabitants. Some of the basin covers the commercial centre of Yangon, and the livelihoods within the region are predominantly agrarian. The delta divides into 11 identified river reaches, 6 of which have been classified as having highly aquatic species rarity, particularly for migratory species such as the hilsa that migrate inland from the sea to spawning grounds within wetlands and marsh areas in the delta. The fisheries sector within the Irrawaddy is really important because fish is a major protein staple in Myanmar. Consumption levels range between 19 to 25 kilograms per capita per year in both coastal and areas with access to inland fisheries. There is little difference between urban and rural consumptions, but there are important differences in where consumed fish is sourced. So local consumption is higher in rural areas where communities are closer to fisheries, both marine and freshwater. Urban areas, which are much more affluent, eat more imported and aquaculture fish products than rural areas. So this is really significant because it means freshwater fisheries are economically significant and play an important role in supporting rural livelihoods and food security. And the Delta area accounts for 90% of all inland fisheries within the country. It employs over 1.58 million people, which is likely an underestimated value. And aquaculture is still relatively underdeveloped, representing 22% of inland fisheries. But the fisheries sector is extremely under threat, mainly due to a lack of data and monitoring on species-specific disaggregation rates of extraction, local fish ecology, and identification and protection of significant habitats within the delta. There's fragmented jurisdictional management, which leads to ministries within Myanmar being siloed and functioning as independent bodies, which results in multiple land-water resource conflicts. Outdated legislative frameworks are also not people-centric, which ultimately means that much of the policies are based on legacy implementation from British colonial times. And these legislations were vested in a revenue tax model for fishing concessions rather than building community incentives for sustainable fisheries management. Poor governing structures are compounded by the above lack of data and jurisdictional clarity within ministries and general oversight of law enforcement of the industry, and inefficient management across the sector due to the lack of data on activities of fisheries and freshwater fishery production in Myanmar hinders the ability of managers and policymakers to understand the current status of local fish stocks and intervene when fisheries are in decline. As a result, fisheries management is reactive, occurring only at points when the ecosystem has virtually collapsed. Prohibited fishing activities are rampant, including poisoning, electrofishing, fishing outside of fishing seasons, illegal and undocumented fishing. And a lot of this is able to take place due to a lack of law enforcement. More significantly is land use conversion, which is being heavily promoted through large-scale agro-industrial developments, including rice cultivation or aquaculture pond expansion. So this previous list basically of threats constitutes unsustainable production practices that could lead to long-term ecological collapse of these fisheries. And the region is susceptible to climate change and natural disaster. And this includes intensive drought and flood events, which are already occurring, as well as typhoons and earthquakes. The most famous natural disaster was Cyclone Nargis in 2008, which left a fatality exceeding 138,000 people. The resilience of the region to recover from this event was exceptionally slow, and severe erosion and decrease in fluvial sediments has rendered the area vulnerable to other natural disasters. By far, man-made infrastructure projects are being developed in silos with no integrated management approach within the agriculture sector and the divergent approaches of development with fisheries management. This is particularly true for irrigation expansions, including dams and reservoir developments, which diverge large quantities of water for rice cultivation. Additionally, little is known about the impacts of developments of hydropower projects in the upper reaches of the basin and extensive land conversion, as mentioned. For instance, 76% of all mangroves have been reduced during the period of 1924 to 1995. And these developments potentially have increased pressure upon the ecosystem, specifically fisheries, yet little is known about their current impact. So this outlines a problem of development of infrastructure, irrigation canals, aquaculture ponds, sluice gates, polder embankments. And these are all developments for the purpose of rice intensification, aquaculture fisheries, and flood prevention. And they have created significant physical barriers within the delta. But these developments impede, and because they impede floodplain connectivity, they affect natural fish movement and migration. And as a consequence, fish populations can be affected due to an inability to spawn in suitable places or at appropriate times. The lack of data in general on fish ecology within the data is a significant problem. Also, the lack of data to quantify the impact of barriers upon fish movement and their ability to migrate towards key spawning grounds within the delta. And there's no comprehensive map of barriers that exist to enable decision-making for water and land management. And in this circumstance, I'm defining barriers in this study as infrastructure that hinders the movement of organisms, specifically fish movement. While more broadly, barriers can also reduce other processes such as sediment flows and nutrient transport. This is not the focus of this study. The intended outcome of this research is to gauge the impact of infrastructure barriers on the contribution of ecosystem services and thus fisheries production in the delta towards food security. The overall research objective is to map existing migration barriers in the Irrawaddy Delta as a means of assessing their impact on connectivity. And specifically, I'm going to address these 3 questions, which I will do individually. So the first question is infrastructure in the Irrawaddy Delta disrupting fish habitat connectivity and fish migration? To be able to assess this, I will need to map the current infrastructure within the lower Irrawaddy Delta. So including barriers such as sluice gate boulders, dams, weirs, fish ponds. I'll try and identify as many large ponds as possible, cultivation areas, Roads and road infrastructure, rivers and other water bodies. I'll use key biodiversity areas and wetlands to identify significant habitats for fisheries. All of these data will hopefully help me to describe a current land use pattern within the region that I can calculate statistics upon and look at infrastructure distances of mainland land use areas, potentially a point pattern analysis to determine high density of areas of rice cultivation and aquaculture. And ideally, I would like to do this over time, but I'm not sure if I'll have time. And the results will feed into the analysis model that I'll describe shortly. So I've already started to look for infrastructure barrier data, and it does exist, but it's inconsistent and often inaccurate. And I'm going to have to clean and compile this data into a new data set before I can use it. It's likely that I won't be able to capture 100% of all barriers within the delta. This is a different perspective on that data over Google Earth image, and you can see the location of barriers there. This area is a large portion of it is aquaculture production because this is the man-made canal that the British put in to transport goods to the city centre. And so I'll try and use ArcGIS supervised classification to map some of the aquaculture pond and overlay it with the Joint Research Centre data for surface water occurrence. And this is the JRC surface water occurrence, which you can tell which plots are standing water bodies and which are not. So this is a satellite image close up of the fish ponds, and you can see they're quite regular and they're smooth in texture. This is a mixed landscape of agriculture and aquaculture land use within the region, and you can see the regular shape of agriculture plots in this image, which is taken pre-planting season when land is being prepared for cultivation. So agricultural land is textured and often black due to burning. In contrast, aquaculture ponds are quite distinct with smooth surfaces and green in colour, and you can see the extent and size of some of these parcels. The second research question I have is, what impacts do land use changes and the developments of physical barriers that impede river and habitat connectivity have on the provision of ecosystem services within the Irrawaddy Delta? And here I'm defining ecosystem services as a fundamental service for maintaining ecosystem functioning and resilience, or demand-derived service based on human values. And I hope to do this using the FIDIMO fish dispersal model, which simulates fish movement based on a dispersal kernel. FIDIMO is built in Python as a grass extension for QGIS, an open source GIS platform, and calculates fish dispersal along river corridors based on user stream network inputs, fish source populations, and species-specific dispersal parameters. Inputs of infrastructure barriers are weighted on the basis of the ability of species to traverse the barrier. It allows for assessments of the implications of barriers, locations on dispersal patterns, and determines fish ability to repopulate habitat reaches based on spatial proximity between source populations and suitable habitats. So I hope to use the model to generate insights into the colonialization of fish species in specific river reach types where no data is available. It will hopefully assess and identify the impacts of barriers of fish migration to spawning grounds by using a weighted barrier passability value. I'm going to run the simulation initially for 2 fish species and identify how many time steps are necessary for the model to produce reliable results to reach estimated baseline populations. The simulations will then be run through different barrier scenarios, so all barriers being passable 75%, 50, 25, then none of the barriers being passable. I initially wanted to do a time step of 30 days, 90 to 70 and 810, but depending on what I get for the first time step and how long it takes, I'll make an evaluation on how many time steps I complete or potentially adding more species to the simulation model. Initially, in my initial scoping, I identified over 20 fish species that were significant. Obviously, the scope of the project is quite large, so I've narrowed it to these two, hilsa and climbing fish, which are both significant food sources in the region in apparent decline currently, and also important keystone species. The last question is, how does this all affect the resilience of inland fisheries to natural disasters and associated climate and morphological changes? And essentially, the outputs of the FIDMO will help me to predict the approximate dispersal distances in relation to barriers, source populations, and suitable habitats for each species. And the most resilient fish will be identified, and barriers causing the most significant impacts of fish dispersal will be determined. Additional time periods will allow assessments of recolonization periods necessary for fish to establish in particular river reaches. Essentially, the output of the FIDMO enables local people to make more informed decisions about sustainable capture limits based on better knowledge of recovery times of different species before they're at risk. If necessary, the model can be optimized based on local knowledge of the locations and passability of certain barriers in the delta. For expected outcomes, I hope to develop a comprehensive integrated view of infrastructure and land use within the Lower Irrawaddy Delta, a workflow that can be used to generate and evaluate fish dynamics in a data poor region. Develop a decision support tool that could help evaluate impacts of barriers to fish migration and the ability to assess the need to remove, rehabilitate, or alter management of barriers to increase fish stock. Ideally, it will also support the identification of further research needs within the region, specifically field studies to further fine-tune the model, potential policy developments and management strategies for greater oversight of the fishery sector, and this could include better monitoring plans for fish stock and capture rates. Ideally, over time, I hope that this model could be used to provide evidence for a need of legislative reform for better integration of land and water management. Some of the beneficiaries are local stakeholders, such as government officials, community fisheries, local NGOs and INGOs working in fisheries conservation, development agencies contributing to disaster management and climate change, increased environmental resources, sustainability that could contribute to greater productivity across different sectors, and increased livelihood benefits and food security for the Irrawaddy Delta population. Of course, there will be some challenges, and the lack of accurate data of fish populations and suitable habitats will be a compounding factor. Lack of detail about barriers and their management will also be a challenge. Customizing the FIDMO model using Python and R to fit delta parameters, and time constraints to generate enough time series to represent significant changes. The model itself has many limitations, and it doesn't take into consider flood events, which are a regular dynamic within the delta and have significant influence on fish movement throughout the region. It doesn't consider potential influences of invasive species that could hinder recolonization in particular habitat reaches. And it doesn't consider genetic diversity within fractured or isolated populations as a result of river disconnectivity. And this affects species resilience. Genetic diversity is reduced. So I have a very ambitious time frame for this project. I hope to finish most of my data collection to address the first question in August. clean and compile the data and initiate landscape level analysis of the data within the Delta region. And I hope to consult with some stakeholders on outputs to refine the model moving forward. In September and October, I hope to commence simulation runs in grass and optimize as appropriate. I want to synthesize the results and develop map outputs by the end of October, potentially into November, when I will be preparing the final report and presentation. The potential presentation venues are the Greater Mekong Forum on Water, Food and Energy, which is held annually, normally in December, somewhere within Southeast Asia. The FOSS Asia 2020, which is held in March in Singapore, or coordinate a local stakeholder meeting with relevant line ministries and conservation groups, which might be a big win in terms of local implementation of the model and shifting some sort of buy-in from stakeholders to use it as a decision-making tool. Some of my references, several of my references. Questions?
Any questions? I think if you have a question, just you can use the microphone. There's only a small group of us here. I'll start with a question. So I think this is a very interesting project, and you certainly have a lot of challenges ahead. What would be, because your study area is so big, is there a particular area that you think might be useful to concentrate on?
Yes. So if I just take the slides back. The reason why I highlighted this region next to Yangon is because this is one of the most intensive aquaculture and land conversion regions in the Irrawaddy Delta. And up in these headwaters here are key spawning grounds. And all of this aquaculture and agriculture development along this reach, including this canal, has greatly influenced and impacted this area in terms of productivity of fish level and also pollution downstream. So this would be an ideal area to narrow it to if I needed to.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This may be a little bit off topic. I don't know, but are you going to interview any of the local fishermen to get their perspectives on this project?
I won't have time to do that, not at all. But I have been coordinating with the World Fish people locally in Myanmar, who have been conducting a lot of studies within the region and have done a lot of fish surveys. Also, FFI, Fauna and Flora International, have provided some inputs into fish conditions and species. They did the initial species identification within the region and an assessment of fisheries within the region. And I hope actually that the results I'll work closely with both World Fish and FFI, and hopefully they can take it forward. That's my hope in the future anyhow.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck with all your work you have to do. We look forward to seeing the final, your final findings and everything.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, our next presenter is Marciela Stephanie. I don't know which you prefer. If you can just load up your presentation.
Okay. I go with by Stephanie.
Okay,
Yeah.
Stephanie then. I know that you're squishing the presentation between work and stuff in your lunch hour, so
Yeah,
I'm glad you could make it.
definitely. Can you see my screen?
So you have 25 minutes with 5 minutes of questions. I will, because you came in just a little bit late. There's a little twinkle sound. Oops, hold on. That I'll put off if you're at 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
Okay. So whenever you're ready, go for it.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and today I will be presenting you my capstone project proposal, a spatial and temporal analysis of fentanyl and cocaine overdose deaths in Pennsylvania during the 2016-2017 period. And I would like to thank Professor Kessler for his help throughout this research. So why did I choose to make this study on Pennsylvania during this time frame, and why is this study relevant? Well, first and foremost, the United States is experiencing an increase in fentanyl and cocaine-related overdose deaths, which makes it an undeniable national security problem as it kills thousands of Americans every year. While fentanyl is an opioid, cocaine is an alkaloid, and both are strong stimulants. On the one hand, fentanyl is an opioid known to be as a heroin substitute, as it is much stronger but cheaper to produce and sell. It is approved for legitimate use as a painkiller and an anesthetic. On the other hand, cocaine is derived from coca leaves and other chemicals. A recent study from the DEA reports show that fentanyl is usually consumed along with cocaine. The latter is allegedly used as an adulterant of the existing heroin supply. These overdose deaths are attributed to two factors: China's recent upsurge in fentanyl manufacturing, which is later distributed to Mexican transnational crime organizations, and a decreased effort to eradicate Colombia's coca crop. According to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, in 2017, Pennsylvania was one of the 5 states with the highest drug overdose deaths and one of the states with a statistically significant increase in drug overdose deaths rates from 2016 to 2017. Using this information as a backdrop, I will identify the spatial distribution of the specific drugs that are consumed in rural and urban Pennsylvania. While it is expected that residents of rural areas to be sicker and poorer, which contributes to the rural-urban mortality gap, this is an area not representative of drug-related deaths. In this sense, I will examine whether sex, age, race, residence, and household income have an influence on this distribution, noting any clusters that may exist. I would also like to identify whether there is a seasonal trend to the overdose deaths. I hope the results will bring some insight into the spatial distribution of drug-related deaths in Pennsylvania. Given that to a certain extent our behavior is influenced by our environment, I want to determine how our socioeconomic variables, such as the one I just recently mentioned, related to fentanyl and cocaine consumption in Pennsylvania. We all know the location matters. In a general sense, I want to understand the role that geography plays in influencing drug consumption. Can I access the data and locate the clusters of drug-related overdose deaths? Are there statistically significant clusters? Are they in an urban or a rural area? I would argue that it may also be important to search for a temporal pattern for these overdose deaths, as they indicate the level of availability. All in all, the purpose of this research is to visualize the spatial and temporal trends in the reported fentanyl and cocaine overdose-related deaths at a zip code level throughout Pennsylvania, and see if urban areas present a statistically significant high number of fentanyl and cocaine deaths to compare to rural areas. While there are different approaches to study this phenomena in order to understand and contrast it, A geographical approach proves to be the most compelling, as it studies the spatial distribution of human behavior in terms of natural and human environment in a defined time and space. In this sense, multiple state and federal academia and nonprofit organizations dedicate their mission to analyze drug-related overdose data combined with other data sets to have insights into drug availability and abuse. The following articles resonate with my proposed research as they provide insightful information regarding context and trends. The opioid threat in Pennsylvania, a report that was produced by the DEA and the Pittsburgh School Pharmacy in 2018, is an unclassified and publicly shared report on the DEA website. This provides a detailed county-level analysis of various opioid misuse data sources. The car plot that is shown in this slide shows the number of seeds and analyzed fentanyl and fentanyl-related substance presence in Pennsylvania counties in 2017. The areas that are depicted in a darker brown are urban areas in Pennsylvania, and those have the highest number of exhibits of fentanyl. The ones that are on a lighter tone are the ones that have the lowest presence of fentanyl. Analysis of seized drug presence concluded that fentanyl was the third most frequently seized drug in Pennsylvania in 2017. The study reveals that there is a correlation in the decrease of heroin and fentanyl seizures, suggesting the latter is supplied as a replacement. So fentanyl seizures increased over 290% from 2016 to 2017. This map here shows substance presence in Pennsylvania by county, where counties, although an individual county level analysis was performed for 2015 to 2017 for quarterly trends, age distribution, gender distribution, race, percent of overdose deaths, percent of overdose deaths per drug category per age, per drug category per gender per year, per drug category per race. This report does not provide a proper visualization of the spatial patterns at a granular level for rural and urban distribution. Also in this slide, we can see that the photographs are evidence of fentanyl seizures coming from China to Pennsylvania through commercial flights. In this research, the National Drug Threat Assessment, also by the DEA, it was also published in 2018. This provides a strategic assessment of illicit drugs in the United States. The bar graph shows an increase in cocaine exports from Colombia since 2012. The prediction is that this trend will not decrease, but continue to grow at an exponential rate. The Carpos map on the right depicts the 2016 cocaine-related overdose deaths per 100,000 people by state. On this map, while not falling in the highest data class, Pennsylvania is shown to have a cocaine-related death rate between 2.1 and 4.2 in 2016. A conclusion from this report is that cocaine has migrated to states with prior high opiate presence. Another DEA report utilized data from the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office to produce the cocaine-fentanyl combination Pennsylvania study in 2018. This study provided an assessment of laboratory and analyzed fentanyl and cocaine seizures as a response of the increasing the consumption of both drugs. This graphic on the left, it shows the percentage of deaths due to cocaine usage in combination with other drugs such as fentanyl, heroin, benzodiazepines, prescription opioids, methamphetamine, and derivations of fentanyl. This data shows that there is an increase of cocaine usage in conjunction with fentanyl of over 30% from 2016 to 2017. This is shown in this graph in the teal green bars. This other research, drug presence in Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2016, presents a bar graph depicting the cocaine presence the cocaine presence that started increasing starting in 2015, and fentanyl usage started in 2014. Cocaine, depicted in the orange bars, and heroin, depicted in the red bars, have a larger percentage compared to fentanyl. According to this graph, cocaine rose in 2016 for the first time since 2004. On the other hand, heroin and fentanyl, in purple, are on the rise. Especially fentanyl seems to be growing rapidly with an increase of 0.71% to 5.01% from 2014 to 2016. The report provided a review of laboratory analyzed seizures in Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2016. These findings show that cocaine and heroin have the highest number of incidents after cannabis. Cocaine-related cases rebounded along with the nationwide cocaine availability increase in 2014. By the same token, fentanyl started growing exponentially since 2014. This research confirms the ubiquitous presence of fentanyl and cocaine in Pennsylvania. Even though these studies do a great job presenting data at a state and county level, I am interested in determining spatial trends at a zip code level, as it is the smallest geographic unit available for these drug-related data. I expect to be able to visualize where drug overdose-related deaths taking place, where are the clusters or hotspots. I expect my study to support future analysis that assess what other geographic objects influence drug trafficking or to fill intelligence gaps. For example, it will be beneficial to know if there are any major highways or airports or any other infrastructure located near drug overdose death clusters. For now, I am primarily interested in determining how statistically significant fentanyl and cocaine overdose deaths are contrasted between rural and urban areas in Pennsylvania. The map on the left here depicts the zip code boundaries and the urban areas in purple, while the rural areas were left hollow. The map on the right shows the county boundaries with the urban areas in purple as well, and also the rural areas were left hollow. In this case, the zip code level data provides a larger scale at which my analysis takes place. According to the map, except for Philadelphia, there is no other single county that is completely urban. In this sense, it would not be productive in my analysis to say that Lancaster County, for example, is inherently urban or that Pike County is completely rural. As it is shown, there is a mixture of urban and rural areas that I'll be looking at. The same concept of for Pike and Lancaster applies for the entire state. That's what I'm decided to look at zip code level areas at the administration boundary. In this map, the urban areas depicted in in this map, the urban areas are depicted within the zip codes as the administrative boundaries for the fentanyl and cocaine related deaths for 2016. These deaths are depicted in these red dots, and each dot represents 10 counts. It is noted from this graphic that the deaths that in urban areas are more significant or happen often in urban areas compared to the rural ones, where that's in urban areas I have a count of 120 compared to 57. So, and this is the graphic for fentanyl and cocaine overdose deaths in Pennsylvania in 2017. The graphic, the urban areas are also depicted in purple, and the dots also represent the overdose deaths. These dots also have the same density as the previous map for 10 counts. Each dot represents 10 counts. And here we can see that the rate for the deaths had definitely increased. Deaths in urban areas accounted for 190 counts compared to 72 in rural areas. Okay, so the methodology that I have define is that I will manage the data in MGIS 10.6. I will perform my spatial correlation analysis in GeoDA and my statistical analysis in R, as well as my regression. So my methodology takes place in two parts. I will do the spatial correlation, where I will define the Morans, the global Morans one, since this is a measure of spatial correlation that evaluates whether a pattern is expressed as clustered, dispersed, or random. I will calculate for the number of instances of fentanyl and cocaine-related deaths, population, poverty, median income, and employment variables. This global statistic will either accept or reject the spatial randomness hypothesis. I will also look at the local indicators of spatial association, ELISA, as this indicates where clusters take place at the local level, identifying the location of the cluster and assessing its significance. It will be applied to the number of instances of fentanyl and cocaine-related deaths, population poverty, median income, and unemployment variables. It will help us assess the influence of individual location on the magnitude of the global statistics, and it will use to identify the outliers. For the statistical analysis, I will first and foremost assess the multicollinearity of my variables, since the self-economic variables are foreseen to be related to each other. So I want to assess how is that one variable is already containing the other, in order to see how is this going to affect my regression analysis. I will also perform the spatial regression that will help us describe the spatial patterns, and lastly, I will do a linear contrast within an analysis of variance and ANOVA to determine the temporal trend significance. So through this geographical analysis, I expect to test the hypothesis that urban areas present a statistically significant high number of fentanyl and cocaine deaths compared to rural areas. Therefore, this analysis aims to explain the relationship between fentanyl and cocaine deaths and socioeconomic characteristics in relation to their environment, in this case, their geographic residence. And I will hope to determine spatial behavior patterns to establish explanatory and predictive theories and possible policies. One of the poison's limitations is the multicollinearity, as I have already mentioned, and how is this going to affect the model? Because if it really affects it if I assess it as a high multicollinearity, then, for example, this model will not be able to be used for prediction, and then I would have to figure out if I need to change any other data or collect any other data, or maybe change the analysis or not. So this is I find like this is going to be something and a key finding in my analysis as I perform it. So my project milestones, I would like to complete my quantitative analysis by the end of August, in order to complete my capstone report by September, as I will be presenting at the Applied Geography Conference in October. I have already submitted my abstract to present at the conference, and this will take place in North Carolina at the end of October. So once I get my feedback from the conference, I will take this into consideration, as well as the feedback they give me today, in order to better my analysis and edit it as if I need to, or maybe do further analysis if I need to, and then I will expect to submit my final project by December. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
I have a question. So are there any limitations within the data that you're using in terms of how the DEA collected that data, or are there any biases?
Yeah, there's certain limitations as mostly in extracting the data, because sometimes it's aggregated and I have to disaggregate it. Sometimes the information, like the data from the DEA, does not match the parameters that I want to use in terms of time frame. So I've also found other sources besides the DEA that that have this data in a more raw presentation. There's these nonprofit organization that works with DEA. It's called the Overdose Free Pennsylvania, and they do their own assessments and they do their own analysis that does not align with mine, but I'm able to extract their data, and since they do work with DEA and DEA uses that same data and it uses for their own analysis, I believe that that's valid data that I can actually rely on. And yeah, so there's certain limitations in terms of data, because sometimes like they would combine fentanyl, cocaine, drug data, or combine it with other drugs that I'm not looking into. I'm not looking at into this project. So there are some limitations in terms of that.
Thanks.
I have a question. With you mentioned socioeconomic data. What kind of factors, I think I missed that bit, will you be looking at?
I'll be looking at age, sex, race, residence, urban or rural, and household income. So already by like that's when I'm not gonna have the issue of the multicoloniality, because we can already predict that the higher your income, we can already predict where you're gonna reside. Like if you have a very high income, you're less likely to live in a rural area. So I'm gonna have to assess this correlation between among the independent variables.
Thanks. Any more questions? I think that's it. Thank you very much. Good luck with the rest of your working on your project, and we look forward to seeing your final results.
Thank you.
Okay, our final presenter, Dan.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, great.
Can't see the slides just yet.
Let me see if I can do this here. Share that.
Yep, that looks good.
Excellent. Yeah, I went and got a second screen so I can use the presenter mode. So this should be helpful.
Should work. Yeah. Whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in to my presentation here. I want to thank Prue and Stephanie for setting the bar so high. I'm afraid you're going to be I don't have anything quite as interesting as your presentations, but we'll see where this goes. I'm proposing the development of a tool in ArcGIS Desktop or in ArcPro using Python that will evaluate whether one polygon can fit inside of another. And that's therefore the title of my presentation is, Will This Fit in That? So it occurred to me, you know, we as GIS-focused individuals use GIS in very specific manners, and GIS is very, very good at performing analysis on existing spatial relationships, and it is less good at analyzing potential spatial relationships. Right? It's very good at telling you whether or not a point exists inside of a box, but it can't tell you whether a polygon can fit inside of a polygon. And being able to determine, the answer to that question struck me as at least as meaningful as defining whether or not it exists in the first place. And it holds real value. It holds real meaningful value, as we'll see. Also, it's a problem that is, I think, uniquely suited to the strengths of both GIS software and to the strengths of the people who use that software. And I think probably the best way to describe the scenario that I'm describing here is to give you the example that came to me several years ago. A client approached us and asked us to help them with a problem. They were trying to rewrite their zoning regulations. This was a municipality. And they're trying to rewrite their zoning regulations. And they asked us, of their 20,000 or so parcels, given a set of setbacks from their parcel boundaries and accounting for existing building footprints, what of those 20,000 or so parcels, which and how many could, in the residual parcel area, support buildings of a particular set of dimensions? And it's an interesting problem when you expand that to 20,000 parcels, right? Because I can, for instance, I can look at this parcel right here, and I can see, I can draw a box and I can rotate it manually, and I can give them the answer yes or no. Does that fit in there? And I can look over here and I can see, no, it doesn't. But when you're talking about 20,000 parcels, you really need a tool to be able to evaluate that volume of work effectively. And I'll just mention that during this presentation, I'll be talking about parcels and buildings as the two comparison shapes, but it really applies to any kind of polygon. So this is a problem that has real relevance. It's as we just saw, it's manifested in government situations. It has social impacts. It has meaningful impacts to the applications of law. But it also has economic impacts. You could consider a manufacturer trying to identify whether a pattern can fit in a particular space on a set of stock, to maximize the investment that they get out of that stock. So it's both social and economic value to answering this question. And when we think about the question about whether something will fit in another, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, the area, but the area is insufficient because a box that is 2 by 5 has less of an area than one that is 5 by 5, but they will not completely contain one another. So some comparison needs to be assessed based on the polygon's configuration of sides and vertices. And that's what I propose to do. So this is not a GIS-specific problem. It has been asked a lot in the past 30 or 40 years, probably since the beginning of the introduction of CAD and GIS in the late 60s and early 70s, and in particular with the rise of computational geometry, and that, as I mentioned, grew out of CAD and the manufacturing aspects of the use of that software. So in thinking about this problem, the first thing I tried to assess was whether or not an assessment could be made of the area. There exist tools in GIS now to evaluate a minimum bounding rectangle or a minimum bounding polygon. And if that minimum bounding, the area of that minimum bounding geometry can be compared to the maximum inscribed area of a similarly shaped polygon, then the area should be sufficient for making this assessment. But this only identifies whether or not a polygon, a building, if you will fit in a parcel. It doesn't identify necessarily where. It only answers the binary yes or no. It also begets another type of problem, which is how do we define the maximally inscribed rectangle or the maximally inscribed polygon? And this particular avenue has a number of interesting solutions, both formal and informal. As I started looking into this, I began with the informals, the posts that were on GeoNet and blog posts and what have you. And as for this research, I became aware of many, many more formal sources as well. One informal source was developed by a guy named Xander Baker, who is who works for Esri Columbia, and this post was on GeoNet. It works particularly well for convex polygons, but it does not handle non-convex polygons such as we have here in green. And that's a particular limitation when it comes to parcels, because parcels will be of irregular shapes such as this. It also iterates through the analysis of the placement of the interior rectangle in increments. So it steps around the sides incrementally at some value that is set by the user. So it doesn't evaluate the entire side, which is a bit of a problem for what I would like to do. This is another example of an approach to that same solution by a guy named Daniel Smilkoff. And his approach is a little bit different in that he seeds the evaluation polygon with a number of centers first, and then constructs the axes, of that polygon. But again, steps through and iterates through a series of aspect ratios and rotations without necessarily evaluating all points on the edge of the evaluation polygon. Understandably, considering there could be many, many hundreds, thousands. The formal approaches were outlined in some of these resources that I have here. A lot of them focus on axis-aligned or rectilinear polygons. And one in particular, that is orientation independent, that I found quite interesting. This one by Nauer, which tries to identify statistically the orientation of a theoretically maximally inscribed rectangle in any given polygon. It tries to take the shape and statistically point out which direction it should be pointing, and then use that as the axis to align your axis-aligned rectangles. So a couple of different formal approaches that all tend to, again, create estimates, which is a little less than what I wanted to achieve. Two formal approaches that seem very convincing, and some very interesting work by these gentlemen, was one by Bernard Chazelle in 1983, who wrote a paper called The Polygon Containment Problem, and it's perhaps the first formal expression of this solution. And it's a completely geometric approach, and it does succeed in evaluating whether a polygon can be contained by another without the iterative estimations that we just covered. And another one by Ghosh makes use of something very, very interesting called a Minkowski decomposition, which I found really quite beautiful, and it's a way to add and subtract shapes. It's used quite often in video game design for collision detection. And my proposal seeks to use both of these in some regard. So first, I'm going to deal with Chazelle's approach. And Chazelle identifies that there are two distinct types of contact between a polygon if one is contained within another. And those distinct contact points are of type 1, in which the vertex of a building, I'll say, it sits on the edge of a parcel. And then the opposite of that, if the edge of the parcel sits on the vertex of a building, is the second distinct type. And what's important to understand about that is that since the vertices are considered part of the edge that they create, when a vertex of a building is coincident with the vertex of a parcel, two distinct types of contact are created simultaneously. And that's important because, as Chazelle says, three distinct points of contact are required for what he calls a stable placement. And he argues that stable placement exists where those three contact points exist. And he proves in his paper that if a polygon can contain another, then there exists at least one stable placement. And implicit in all of this is the understanding that containment is, his evaluation of containment is in the extreme. It's happening at the edge. No assessment of the interior need be made because the extreme condition of contact at the edge defines that containment can be made. Ghosh's approach and Minkowski's decomposition is quite fascinating, I found. This is sort of the theory behind Minkowski decomposition, and it says if we were to take this building right here and this parcel, and we were to shrink this building down to a point, and we were to simultaneously shrink the parcel at the same rate, and in this case this parcel has a hole, so we'd have to grow that hole at the same rate in all directions, then by the time that this building got to a point, the residual area, if there were any residual area of the parcel, would indicate that containment of the building can be made in the parcel. Further, I'm just going to kind of cover over this little piece. Imagine that we've dissolved this building down to the point, and this is the zone that happens, that results. If we start growing that building from its point back to its original shape and simultaneously growing the resultant zone, since this has been completely decomposed, it does not grow, and the zone that results is the zone where the full-size building can be placed for containment. So that's the theory. In this slide, this is sort of the application. We've got a parcel here that in a building, and we place that building along the edge of the parcel, and we move it all along the edge of the parcel. What that does is effectively erases the zone where the building makes contact with the parcel, leaving a residual that identifies whether or not containment can be made. What it fails to take into account is the possible rotation of the building, because as you can see, this little sliver right here means that the building could rotate in some manner. So that's something I want to try to address in my approach. So this gives us, we've got estimations that are good but not perfect. Non-convex shapes can produce problems. Chazelle's approach can handle non-convex shapes, but it seeks to find stable placement. And Ghosh's nicely identifies a zone, but can't really handle the rotation problem of the building. And so my proposal then is to build a tool in Python 3 as a script that can be run kind of standalone or imported into ArcPro as needed, that will identify both its containment as possible and the zone where it can be contained, where the building can be contained. And because, going back to our original problem of 20,000 or more parcels, I want to take advantage of multiprocessing as much as possible so that we don't have to wait days for the thing to run. Some assumptions and understandings about what this process will involve. We're going to evaluate simple polygons only. Okay, there'll be no self-intersecting polygons. There'll be no no donuts. There'll be single rings only. Evaluation will be strictly by rotation of the building and translation, moving it side to side. There would be no mirroring. We're going to keep things simple by using convex shapes only, although theoretically this would work with non-convex shaped buildings as well. And as Giselle pointed out, we're going to assume that in the extreme case, containment will happen at the edge and interior space, therefore need not be evaluated. To do this, we're going to make some assumptions and optimizations. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to compare the areas of all the parcels and to that of the building. And any parcel that doesn't have enough area to support our building, we're going to eliminate. Then we're going to move to the sides of the parcels, and any parcel that does not have a side long enough to support at least one side of the building will be eliminated. We're also at that time going to build a dictionary of the parcel edges paired with the representative building edges. So here I've got an edge that is of unit 15 that can support exactly one edge of my building. Here I've got one that is 19 that can support 1, 2, 3 edges of my building, and like that, so that we're not evaluating edge pairs needlessly. And the approach, in a nutshell, is going to be to identify for each edge pair 2 extreme stable placements that will define the zone where the particular rotation can happen. So in this case, I've got a red polygon here and a blue polygon here representing the 1, 2, 3 distinct contact points. That's stable placement. That's another one here. 2, another set of 3 distinct contact points for 2 stable placements in the extreme for that rotated edge. The convex hull of the pair identifies the zone where that rotation can exist for that edge pair. And so stepping through the process here in a fashion, we're going to compare our first edge, and then ask the question, is the building contained in the parcel? The answer is no, so we'll move on. Again, ask the question, the answer is no, we'll move on. Here we get to the point where we've got the first edge that can support multiple placements. And we note that we can draw this zone where by sliding the building parcel down this way, right? But we need to identify how far to move it, and that's going to be something of the tricky bit. Because the answer is not, it looks like we can just say, well, I just need to move it until this vertex contacts that vertex, but I'm not interested in whether it contacts a vertex necessarily. I'm interested in when any vertex makes another stable placement or makes another distinct contact and results in stable placement. So that could be any vertex. Importantly, I'm also not interested in just the shortest, because this value right here might be shorter. It has to be in that direction. So how do we evaluate that? In the case of interior containment, if a polygon is contained, we're going to be looking for the shortest the shortest line passing through one of the vertex of the building that is parallel to the edge of evaluation. In the case of a polygon of a placement where the building is not contained initially, we'll be looking for the longest line parallel to the edge of evaluation. We'll then slide this building this way until it is contained, and then we can evaluate the interior containment rule. And once that's done, we're going to end up with the zones where we'll have our 2 stable placements for each edge pair. Doing that for all edge pairs on all sides, and then merging the resultant convex hulls should result in a zone of feasibility, to use Gauche's term. So my anticipated results, I anticipate success, obviously, I guess, but I also anticipate a lot of challenges, not the least of which is going to be writing all of this code. And I think that one of the biggest problems is going to be that identifying the direction in which to slide the building. I've kind of come up with this idea that if I draw a line perpendicular to the vertex of the first placement, perpendicular to the edge being evaluated, and I can identify all the vertices of the building that are to the left of that line or to one side of that line, then I've identified the vertices that I need to evaluate and their length, their distance to the parcel edge. It kind of reminds me of those old pill counting trays where you drop a blade down in between some pills and you slide the pills over to that pharmacists use. So I've called this the pill counting vertex problem, and that's going to be a problem, I think. Not to mention learning all the new Python packages that I need to, such as Shapely, NumPy, and SciPy. But that's all part of the fun, I guess. So I'm looking forward to that. I have submitted an abstract for this already to the NEARC Fall Conference, which is in October up in Sunday River, Maine. But if I'm honest with myself, this is a lot of development to try to achieve, and I'm not so sure that I can complete that by December. So I've looked out ahead to the Esri Developer Summit and the NEARC Spring Conference, which is in 2020. Ultimately, by the user conference next year in San Diego, I should be able to have this all wrapped up. And those are the right now what's being kind of posited. But if this happens quicker than I expect, then I may look for others. With that, I'll open it up for questions.
Questions? I don't really have a question per se, but wow is all I can say. It's hard to imagine that something like that doesn't really already exist, because
exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly. it's I mean, why doesn't it exist?
Yeah,
so,
but
I mean,
I think you've shown why, because it's so complex and to figure out, and with all those different rules that you have to put in on what is, constitutes as fitting into that space.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest here, this is a lot to bite off, and I feel better about, now that I've thought it through, I feel better about how to get there. It's just making it happen is daunting.
Well, I think the way you've highlighted it is really good, and you start with the easy bits are whether it fits into that space or not, and then the next bit is, well, how many sides does it fit in? Does it touch on the vertices and things like that? So once you get that set out, you'll find that it's probably go through it a lot faster. It's the tweaking of it that is the difficult bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I have one question. You demonstrate the building parcel example. Do you foresee other applications for it? I'm just trying to think. That's a really great one, but I was just trying to think.
Yeah.
Of applications.
Well, I think I gave the example of a manufacturer trying to determine if a particular shape will fit on stock. So I think that's another great one. I could see it being used in development, probably most. I think in parcel development, in government, and in perhaps even like environmental planning, if we're like wetlands restoration. I could see that being used in those types of applications as well.
Thanks.
Possibly even with a tax assessor office determining any kind of overage. You know, if someone expands a house, is that really appropriate for the dimensions of the property, for example?
Exactly.
People aren't always abiding by property boundaries and
Setbacks and such.
yeah, setbacks and
Their variances.
yeah. So you know, I could see this having a number of applications beyond just a simple, I have a space now, what kind of building or what size of building can I put there?
And hopefully I can, you know, turn it to some, you know, public forum where it gets disseminated widely.
One other question, Dan. I know you went through a lot of very useful visuals for your presentation. Are you envisioning your program to have some kind of a visual component to it where the person, you know, the user can experiment with different settings, parameters for the program to work?
I think maybe perhaps eventually. You know, right now I'm just considering writing it as a standalone script to be used, imported into as a script tool in ArcPro, and then that will expose certain parameters at that point. I think I can see I can see the functionality of allowing a user to say, for instance, set to ignore certain parcels that are whatever within 100 feet of a wetland or something like that. I can see those types of parameters being very applicable, but I don't have any plans at the moment to incorporate those kinds of things.
I mean, mathematically speaking, I guess it could be possible that given certain circumstances, there might be two optimal solutions or more.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
If you're talking about a parcel that is perfectly square and another, or a building that's perfectly square, what optimal solution would that be? There's not just one optimal solution, right?
Right, yeah, so that would, I mean, in this scenario, my script would evaluate the building at every edge, and it would draw a zone of containment within, you know, the dimension of the building along the edge of the parcel, and there'd be this hole in the middle that would be assumed to also be able to contain the building. So there'd be many placements where that building could fit in the square parcel, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is to identify the zone of feasible placement.
But I guess in situations like that, you'd would also have to recommend that, or put a caveat saying that this isn't the optimal placement; it is a placement. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm not trying to find an optimal placement. I'm trying to identify all possible placements.
Right, and that kind of loops back to my initial thought there about having a visualization of, like you said, that zone of containment, highlighting where the building could exist, even though the building may be smaller and likely smaller than what the zone of containment actually is, right?
Yeah, the output, maybe I didn't mention it, the output, this tool would output a new feature class that would be zone of containment to be used.
Okay.
I really, at some point, I really want to work in the Minkowski decomposition, because that is just, I think that's super, super cool, but the math there, I mean, was a little tricky.
Any other questions? I think that's it. Thank you very much, and good luck with your project.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today.
Right. So we just need to fill out the the evaluations for the reviewers that were presented today, or are there